So we're recording now. So some things I want to go through. I want to talk a little bit about program enrollment versus member enrollment, adult-only data, all member data, and we'll touch on annual assessments a little bit here, but I have a little bit more detail in some slides further down. So in Caseworthy, when you look up a client, so you do find client and case management, you go to the project enrollments and you get to your enrollment screen. This is the household enrollment. It's not necessarily the individual member of the household's enrollment. What I mean by that is when you talk about households with more than one person, when you're in this client, when you're in the client record, so in this case, I'm in the head of household record, the project enrollment screen, in most cases, the project start date is going to match the member start date for the head of household. And you can look into that by just clicking the gear next to the enrollment you want to look up, click on the word member, and this is going to take you to all the members associated with this enrollment. All right, so for this particular enrollment, there is the head of household and the child are enrolled in this project. As you can see, the head of household start date is 7/1/2017, which matched the overall household start date, but the child, their member start date is 8/1/2018 because they joined the household later on. And why I want to point that out is if I go look at the child's record now, and I go to project enrollment, as you can see, the start date here is the household start date. So it's just important to identify that distinction when you're talking about program enrollments and the date that a client actually joined the household and their actual enrollment started. So if you're in a record other than the head of household, it's always good to double check the member enrollment to see if that date is the same as the head of household or is it some date later on, okay? That's just one sort of nuance with Caseworthy I want to make sure everybody understands. The other items that we'll go into is, before I jump into the adult only and member and all member data, I do also want to talk quickly about the family and contacts, because I know there's situations where you'll have individuals who are part of more than one household. You'll look up the client and you'll see the client name show up twice. They have one household ID with one enrollment, another household ID with another enrollment, and that can be very confusing. A client can be part of more than one household. That's perfectly allowable in the system, and it's allowable by HUD. Whether or not it's correct is another story. And it's very important that you don't try to correct that problem on your own. What you'll find is you may think you're fixing the problem, but in reality, you're actually ending a household where there are valid enrollments, and you've then disconnected those enrollments from the assessments and other information on the client record. So where you can see the multiple household situation is if you go to case management and click on family and contacts. If a person is part of more than one family, you would see two family names, for example, and two family IDs. And for people that think that they're sure that this individual is only part of this one family, they see the second family there. And I know some people in the data cleanup process, there's been a lot of work that's been done on the end user side, especially to try to get your data cleaned up for APRs. You go in, I've seen in some cases that people have clicked on the family and they then click on the gear. You can go to edit. And when you get to the edit screen, you can actually select each member and you can actually end the family by putting an end date here, and it will clear the family so you no longer see them. And now you would only see one family for this particular client. The problem being is that each family may have had separate enrollments And some of those enrollments might have been correct enrollments for your agency, or they might have been correct enrollments for a different agency, because you're now in an open system. So you're now sharing client information across the entire database. So you may be seeing a family with your client in it that somebody at a different agency had created, or somebody had created back in MacLink, and then now it's converted, and now you're seeing it as well. So if you see a situation where you find a client and the client shows up twice with two different family names and you're not sure which one's correct, you can always send in an email and say, hey, I'm seeing this client, 641648, is showing up. And if you go to the case management, family and contacts, you'll see all the family information, and you can just tell us the family ID number, and that will help us identify which family you're seeing. If you see two families, tell both family ID numbers, and what we can do is the family ID numbers actually match up with the program enrollment ID number, which I'm going to talk about in a minute as well. And then we can line up and see, okay, which family and which enrollments make the most sense for all the agencies who've worked with this household. The other dynamic with Caseworthy is that when you look at the person icon up in the top left, and let's say your experience with the client has always been as an individual, you've never dealt with these other family members, and you think, oh, well, geez, I didn't enroll these people, why are they showing up here on the left-hand side? Just because when you click the drop-down here, you see your client and then other family members, it doesn't mean those members are enrolled at your program. It just means that in the system, this client has been associated with these two other individuals. Whether that's correct or not, again, is another story. And that's something we can help you evaluate as well. But all you need to worry about to know if these other members are impacting your client is if these other members have an enrollment in your program. So for example, our test client here has several enrollments, a few with Kim Wilson Housing, and then a coordinated entry, and then the enrollment you see here for the Rapid Rehousing Project. So if you wanted to know, for example, if this client here, the child, is impacting the Kim Wilson Housing enrollments, you would just have to click on the child and take a look. Okay, so you can see that this child is not part of the Kim Wilson Housing projects. This child is only part of this Rapid Rehousing project. So you know that just because this child is here, and if you're with Kim Wilson Housing, this child is not impacting your data. But again, if you think that that person should never have been associated with that household, that's fine. That's something we can evaluate as well. But just send in the email asking for assistance because you're seeing client 664191 with your head of household client, and you're not sure that that's correct, and we can take a look and see if that's true or not. Okay, so those are some things that it's just important to understand, that even though you might have the ability to end a household, you shouldn't necessarily do it without communicating with us first, because we want to make sure by looking at the different enrollments associated with the various households, because if you end a household, you can actually clear out enrollments that may belong to another organization or another agency that's working with that separate household. All right, so the next item on a project enrollment screen is here with 2936811. That's the enrollment ID number for this particular enrollment. This is the enrollment ID number for this enrollment. Those ID numbers are unique for each enrollment. They're separate from the client ID. The client ID is the client's ID number, which follows them everywhere in the system. Once you enroll that client into your project, the system also assigns an ID number. That ID number is a very important tool that you can use to communicate a problem. So if you think there's something wrong with this particular enrollment, an easy way to tell us that would be to give us the enrollment ID number along with the client ID. You always have to provide the client ID number. That's the first layer of starting the investigation. But if you give the client ID and the enrollment ID, we immediately know which enrollment, therefore which project you're talking about, And we also know which assessments you're referring to, because the enrollment ID ties itself to all the assessments, and we can see that on the back end. So those are some communication tools to help when you have a problem. Provide the client ID, and if you see the enrollment, provide the enrollment ID. And then we can kind of start diagnosing the issue to see what's going on. If you don't think the enrollment should be there, if the enrollment is dated incorrectly, the enrollment is causing problems on your APR, things like that, that number is very valuable. The other thing that we've seen is the deletion of enrollments. You can delete an enrollment, but it is not a favorable thing to do, because what you can't do is you can't delete the assessments. So when you delete the enrollment, you've orphaned the assessments, and some of you out there, I know we've had these discussions before. And then it does become a bit of a challenge to clean things up. But anytime you delete an enrollment, they always end up here in the teardrop. So those of you, if you're logged in right now, you can go ahead and click on the teardrop if you're in the program enrollment screen. And when you click on that, it will show you the recycle bin. If there's a deleted enrollment here, it'll show up in the recycle bin. And if you deleted it by accident, all you have to do, if it were here, there'd be a little checkbox, and then you click restore. And then you've restored the enrollment, and then you're done. And you've actually brought that enrollment back. It will relink itself to anything that's got this ID number, and you should be good to go. And you can then edit the enrollment if you need to, or we can assist you if there's some other problem with the enrollment. Okay, any questions about those items? No? Okay. All right, so now we'll get into adult-only data versus all-member data. Adult-only data consists of income, non-cash, okay? And also the chronic homeless evaluation for the universal assessment. But more to the point is when you're doing an enrollment, the adults in the household are going to get the non-cash evaluation and the income evaluation. Even though the income table does open when you do a program enrollment and you're in a child record, you will just set that to no and no income. No income gets measured by HUD for somebody under the age of 18 unless it's a runaway homeless youth situation and that person is the head of household, where in that case they can be under the age of 18. But again, in most cases, for most of you out there, PSH, TLP, rapid rehousing, you're dealing with clients who, if somebody is under the age of 18, it's because they're accompanied by an adult. So when you're looking at an entry assessment, you're only going to see non-cash for the adult members and the head of household. That's the only place it gets evaluated for them. And income, the same deal. You're only going to provide income information on the parent and anybody 18 and above. Now, situation where the child gets disability because the child's disabled, you would actually add that amount to the income table for the head of household or the parent. And if for some reason the child were to leave the household, you would then deduct that amount from the parent's financial assessment. So that is something you could do at annual if it happens sometime after enrollment. So then the next annual assessment, you can just remove that dollar amount before the next report gets submitted. Yep, go ahead.
So if we were trained differently, so we'd enter the children under the children because that's how we were trained initially, yeah. Do we need to go back through and fix all those assessments, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I don't know how many occurrences of that do you have?
How many what?
How many occurrences do you have where a child is received, where you've put income with the child, would you say?
I have several children on my caseload and on other caseloads that get disability. So that's under their name, not the parents, because they told us to put it under the child.
Yeah, so the income would then, if you want it to be recorded, and yeah, so it would go into the entry assessment for the financial assessment at entry for the head of household, and then you would just clear it out from the child's financial assessment, set that to no income.
So as of now, all of our data has been wrong and our APR has been wrong because we've all been entering it wrong?
Well, it's one data element. So you've probably had you're just showing a lower number, or a lesser number for income at entry, which, I mean, if it's disability income for the child, what are we talking about? A few, $600 maybe. So it's not hugely impactful, but where the impact will be, the next APR you submit, is that that income will then be recorded and should end up on the APR. And then, of course, that will increase what the income was at entry. But again, it's not going to be anything that you'll get dinged for. It's not going to be anything that will you'll get penalized for necessarily.
So same thing with child support. So we need to put child support under the parent.
Yes, child support goes under the parent. Yeah, so if you looked at the APR, my assumption would be that it was calculating the adults and leaving out any totals that related to the children. But you wouldn't probably be able to tell that just by looking at the APR table. So you should see, after you correct it, an increase in like the total income line for disability, for example. So if, let's say, you just had one family in your project, and the parent was getting $735 SSI, the child was getting $600, the APR should have only picked up the $735 of the parent. Now, if you change it, the parent is going to go from $735 to $1335 the next time you run the APR.
Yeah, and that's why I was asking, because ultimately, if we're trying to increase or maintain income, none of that was being calculated on the APR. So it's not showing that we've increased our income in the household, even though we probably had.
Well, if you did it at entry, the
or
only
annual.
Yeah, or annual, correct. But it's going to be it's going to show that you have two choices. Essentially, you could wait until annual and just do the change then, keep the entry income whatever you had, and then update it at annual because you discovered the error. Or you could go all the way back, edit the entry assessment, which would then increase the income at entry, but then it's the income's gonna be the same at annual, and again, it's a wash essentially. Because you're going to be increasing your entry income from $735, it's going to be now $1335. Your annual income is going to go from $735 to $1335. So it's going to be an increase of overall income, but it's not going to show an increase from one measure to another, and that's what HUD does. HUD looks at entry, so it'll say, okay, at entry you had 735, at annual you had 735. In this case, the only change is your entry is going to go from 1335, your annual is going to go to 1335. So you're not showing that there was an increase in income from entry to annual if you update the parent's income, their entry assessment with the child's data, and then do the same thing at annual. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you do have the two options. You could just update it at annual, and then then it would look like you had a considerable increase at annual, or you could do what the reality is that you then just edit the entry, and then when you update the annual, you'll have the new amount there as well.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so for health insurance and disability is everybody. So everybody should have disability type selected, have a health insurance selected. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about data incongruence in a minute as well. But annual assessment, most of you have been going through this exercise now for a little while. Annual assessment, as you all know, is based on the enrollment start date, the month and day. So if you use the complete annual assessment workflow, you don't really have to worry about anything other than answering the questions as they come up. The system will ask you for your annual assessment date, and you'll just make sure that you date that correctly. And the system will even alert you if you've put in a date that doesn't match the rules for the enrollment that you're doing. So for example, if I tried to do an annual assessment on somebody that came in on 7/13/2018, the system would alert me and tell me that, you know, the person's not eligible for an annual assessment yet. But if I go and let me just reopen this one. If I go to this record to do the annual, I'll go to complete annual assessment. It may, because I already did one on this one, so yeah, I already done one on this one, so this actually won't be a good example. But if I go to the complete annual assessment on this client, it will prompt me for the date. Make sure you put your date in there where it's 30 days before, 30 days after, and then you'll meet the rules for dating the annual assessment, and then it'll enter into the workflow. The workflow will provide you all the necessary assessments for an annual. Annual assessments are only evaluated, they only evaluate the non-cash benefit, HUD health insurance, and the income. They don't evaluate anything else. So it's much more efficient to do your annual assessment off of the project enrollment and click complete annual than it would be if you went in to do it manually. I've seen situations where people are going to assessments, HUD assessments dashboard, and they'll go into HUD program, add new, and then they'll click here, add an assessment, and then they'll create an annual assessment that way by selecting annual. That's a very long way to do it, and it will also mean that most likely you'll do an annual assessment on either a client who's not due, or you'll date it incorrectly, or you'll answer questions that you don't need to answer. So always go off that the workflow that's available for you. Is everybody familiar with this workflow off of here, or have people been doing it the manual way? But I mean, I'm just curious to see. I just want to make sure people were aware of this feature.
Aware.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So the annual assessment is, as I've worked with people on their APRs, has been problematic, and we're going to talk about that a little later on. We're going to actually look at an APR and look at some of the tools that are available to make sure that the annual assessment's dated properly. But if you ever run into a problem, you're evaluating an APR, don't waste more than 20 minutes on one issue. I mean, even that might be a little bit long. I've said this before as well. Give it your best shot, and then submit an email asking for help with an annual assessment for client ID 61648, enrollment 2936811. I can't get the annual assessment to be recognized by my APR. And if you tell us the APR dates, then we can go ahead and reproduce. Okay. Okay. So data congruence, these next two are big ones, and these are big on the APR as well. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to go into assessments. And the first one I'm going to talk about is disabling condition. And so if we look at an entry record, at entry you're asked is if this person is disabled or not, okay? And in some circumstances I see that the response is no. But then when you go look at the HUD program assessment, at entry, and let's just make this a yes, because right now the data is in line. Disabling condition on HUD Universal is no, disability types are no, perfectly fine. But what can't happen is you can't be disabled no, and then mental health yes, and yes, for example. That will cause a data issue on the APR. It'll either cause the data to not be seen, so the mental health condition won't be recognized. Or if you were yes for disabled, but then had all no's for these, that would cause a unknown scenario for this particular client on the APR. So if disabling condition is no, you would expect all these to be no. If disabling condition is yes, you would expect at least one of these to be yes. Now, when we're talking about the qualifying questions that open, so for mental health, for example, I've also seen this situation where mental health is yes, but expected to be of long continued and indefinite duration and impairing ability to live independently. So you have to think of this question this way, is if your project did not exist, would this person still be homeless? And is it their mental health problem that's contributing to that? And in most cases, especially for PSH projects, that was the whole purpose of HUD even creating these permanent supportive housing projects back in 98, 99 with the McKinney-Vento Act, when they passed the law to provide money so people who were essentially exiting mental health facilities, the state mental health facilities that had closed down, a lot of them were ending up on the street, and that's where these dollars were created to get these people off the street and into housing. So in most situations, if somebody has a diagnosed mental health condition, they're on SSI, they've come from an emergency shelter or place not meant for habitation or wherever it might be, they would probably still be in that situation if it were not for your project, and therefore their mental health condition is impairing their ability to live independently. So I just want to make sure that that's at least discussed and that people understand it, and if there's any situations where people have been putting no here, because sometimes, you know, when we're going on client report, you're working with the client, either you're going off of a paper intake where the client said, no, it's not impairing my ability, or you have the client right in front of you and they say, no, it's not impairing my ability. Well, you might want to explore that a little bit with them to make sure they fully understand. And then ultimately, you have to use your best judgment in that case, that if it is clearly the situation, then you would assign a yes to that. Any questions there? Developmental disability, that is usually something that's documented prior to or around the age of 18 or under. It's usually during school years. So if it is a yes for developmental disability, there is some expectation that there's a documentation of that somewhere. Chronic health condition. So just because somebody is yes for HIV does not mean that they are yes for a chronic health condition. Chronic health condition is diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, liver disease, things like that. So you could be yes for HIV and no for a chronic health condition. Physical disability, again, I mean, that's usually apparent. The person has a physical disability, and you know, you can see that whether it's they're using some type of durable medical product to help them be mobile. Substance abuse, in general, a lot of times that's self-report. Sometimes the person does have a treatment program that they're going to, so usually people have pretty good data there. Okay, so that's one place where data incongruence comes into play, where somebody says yes for disabled on HUD Universal, but all of these are no. The other spot it happens is where somebody says yes for covered by health insurance, and then when you get to the health insurance table, they don't select, all the health insurance types are no. If you're yes here, you have to have at least one of the health insurance types selected in the health insurance assessment. If you're no here, then you should be all no's for those health insurance types. So make sure those data, those pieces of data match, because they will cause problems. It'll cause data to be missing on your APR, and it will cause data to be shown as either unknown, don't know, those kind of things, which obviously you don't want for disabling condition and health insurance. You want to have that data collected. Okay. All right. Chronic homeless calculation, just talk about that for a minute, because this does end up on your APR and can be confusing because of the HUD rules behind it. And I'm actually going to open one so you can see how this relates. So on your APR, the last two columns are your chronic homeless evaluation tables. And what's important to note here is that you have household versus individual. So this is the person, this is the household. If somebody is part of a household, the household calculation for chronic homeless on your APR detail could show the household as yes, but the individual person as no, like you see here. And all that means is that this person, their chronic homeless data on the HUD universal equals no, but one or more members of the household is yes, so the whole household is counted as yes. On the APR, there's a calculation that will take this scenario and say yes to household, and it will also say yes for the individual. So if this was a household of 2 people, for example, and you had on the chronic homeless tables on the APR, let's see if I have, we'll look at that when we look at the APR. There's the chronic homeless calculation. So what it would say in this situation, if this was a two-person household, let's say this is the household here, okay, where this is the head of household, they're yes for chronic, they're yes as an individual, their child is no, but the household is yes. So you would have one household of chronically homeless and 2 people who get counted as chronically homeless. Even though the raw data is yes and no, the APR will report them as yes and yes, and that's how HUD wants it. Okay, so just be careful of that. If you're a PSH project that's set up to serve X percentage of chronic homeless, whether it's 100% or 75%, 50%, whatever it is, just make sure that you understand when you look at the detail data, which is this detail export, it will be different than the aggregated data on the APR tables. So if this were a family, the APR would count this as one household of 2 chronically homeless people, okay? I just want to make that distinction, especially for PSH projects, because you deal with this category more than any other project type or as much as any other project type. So if we go look at the universal assessment, you can see the universal assessment will actually tell you if the data you have provided has calculated that person to equal yes or no for chronically homeless. So let's go look at the entry for this client. So if you feel it should be yes, then this is where you would want to go. First indicator of the problem is the person's disabling condition is no. You can never be counted as chronically homeless if your disabling condition is no and you're the head of household. So you would change that to yes if you thought they should be. Now the other problem you have is that length of stay and prior living situation, emergency shelters, 1 night or less, okay, but that's not going to be enough to do it. Start date of homelessness, there's only been a few months, so that won't do it. Only 1 time and only for 2 total months. So the prevailing data says no for chronically homeless. In order to be chronically homeless, most of you who work on this, this assessment, you know that you have to have that 12 months or more, 4 or more episodes, and your start date has to be at least a year ago. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're evaluating chronic homeless for your particular project. Any questions on chronic homeless? No?
I have another question. Everyone's
Sure.
going to hate me because I'm asking questions. So you're saying that it doesn't matter if potentially there's family members that say, no, they are not chronic as long as the household is, even if your grant is written 100% for chronic?
Yeah, so what it's going to do is, let's say you have this scenario, okay? Let's say this is a family, and this member of the family is 22 years old. You have a 45-year-old parent, 22-year-old adult child, 7-year-old adult child. 7-year-old adult child will not be evaluated for chronic homeless at enrollment. They don't get asked these questions. These are only asked of adults. So then you have the head of household, the 45-year-old, is yes for disabled. They've been 90 days or 1 year or longer, and we'll just kick this out a year. And this is 4 more times and 12 months or more. If I save this assessment, you're going to see this person is going to have gone from no to yes for chronic homeless.
So were you saying that those questions that you just showed on my screen weren't asked of children?
They usually, not during program enrollment. If you're seeing them, it just means that the enrollment, some of the enrollments aren't set up to filter out adult-only questions in some cases. Like that's why you see the...
we answer all those for the kids as well.
Okay. The disabling condition is usually the only one that should be showing up for a child's enrollment at entry. If they're under the age of 18, if they're over 18, they may see, you will see these living situation questions. If they are, it's fine. It's not a problem. It's just a little extra data entry. But for if we talk about an adult member or a child member in this case, their data could be very different because, and let's talk about an infant, for example, or somebody, we'll say like a 7-year-old. Let's say the 7-year-old's prior residence was not a homeless situation. Maybe it was foster care, 1 year longer, whatever it might be, but that child's not disabled, okay? Then they're gonna generate a chronic homeless value of no. Same thing with the 22-year-old. They could generate a chronic homeless value of no. But because the head of household is yes, the APR is going to count the household as yes, and the APR is going to count all members as yes. The HUD rule is if one member is chronic homeless, all members are chronic homeless. The detail is only showing you what the data looks like in the assessment, not what it's going to be on the APR in this case. Okay, so if you go look at this and say, wait a minute, this person is part of a chronic homeless household, this should be yes. Well, no, that's not the case here. The APR will convert them to yes on the APR tables, but the raw data will show no. Okay. Any question on that? And I'll just save that and you'll see that they'll go for back to no for chronic homeless for this child, or for this case rather.
So I do have a question. So
yeah.
on households that prior to 2016 where the child was the disabled person, that doesn't create any problem in this.
Yeah, well, what you would have is that then if the household, it was the household considered chronically homeless in 2016. Okay, so as long as you have the data for the child that shows that the child is disabled and the chronic homeless history is there, it should register that as chronic homeless. So we would have to look and see that your universal assessment collected that data for the child. And then
I had a similar scenario, Ramona, as well, and I was instructed because the child was, but it didn't pull because the child had a household. So I had to go back in and make it so that I had a household, even though that household, quote unquote, isn't the disabled one, the case where they would not pull that family as chronic because it was the child that had the disability. So I was instructed months ago to go back and make it so the family looks chronic because they are.
Yeah, they are.
But
that's right.
The data wouldn't pull it. So it's not going to pull if the child's the only one as disabled in the family. You have to make the head of house.
The challenge we all have is that HUD changes rules just about every year. And so you have enrollments that happened under one rule, that then a new rule comes along, and the client, for PSH project especially, the family's still enrolled with you, and then the expectation is that you're going to go back and edit that so it now meets the new rule, because now at one time when the rule said for chronic homeless it's this, but now it's that, then you have to go and edit. So if you have a situation like the two of you have, just you're not 100% sure, we can, number one, we can talk about your two scenarios at the end of the meeting so we can actually look at them. And if we don't have time to do that, we can set up time. You can either send me the client IDs, I can look it over with you, and we can set it up in a way that makes sense for how the household is set up, and that should resolve the issue. But we can look at these two towards the end if you guys have time to stick around for a few minutes just to look at those records. Okay. But yeah, so essentially, if one member is, all members are. HUD is pretty much. So they sort of erased a lot of the rules that used to limit the chronic homeless value. All right, we talked about Enrollment ID. And I know another one that has come up occasionally is this notion of adding a member to an existing enrollment and exiting in a member that leaves but other members stay. So in the PowerPoint, I provided the steps, or the steps that you would go through in Caseworthy to go and exit somebody from a family while enrolling somebody to a family after an enrollment is done. And why that's important is, I'm sure this has happened to some of you, where you've started an enrollment and you get halfway through the enrollment and you realize you forgot to add a family member. Or for whatever reason, you thought you added the family member, but you're not seeing the member show up during the enrollment. You go through the entire enrollment and you have a 3-member family when you should have 4. All right, not a big deal, easy to resolve. All you need to do is follow the steps that are going to be here for you. Is you click on Case Management, then Family and Contacts. You click on Family, the icon for Family. You're going to click on the gear, and then you're going to click on Add and Enroll Family Member. I'm going to show you that now. So as we said, you do Case Management, Family and Contacts. Click on the family icon. Click on the gear next to the family name. Make sure it's the family name that you want. So if you have multiple families, double check to make sure you're clicking on the right family. Then Add and Enroll Family Member. And this will launch the program enrollment workflow. And you go right into it. You just add that one member, and that's it. And that member will be added to the household and to the enrollment. Okay, and then you're done. Another note about the teardrop up here. If you're in a workflow, this teardrop has different options than it would have in other screens. So it modifies based on which screen you're on. So when you're in an enrollment and you need to exit an enrollment, resist hitting cancel down here and resist Xing out up here. You should hit your teardrop and click exit workflow. If you are in the middle of an enrollment and for some reason you get disrupted, there's somebody pulls you away for some reason, you don't have all the data you thought you needed, or maybe you don't have all the data in front of you that you thought you needed, you can actually save your progress in close, and then it will put the assessment in pending status, and you can come back and complete it later. I actually just clicked out of the workflow there. Go to program enrollment. Okay, so in this case, I have a pending status for this particular enrollment. If you saw this, because let's say you saved progress in the middle of a workflow, if you just click on assessment pending, complete entry assessment, it will bring you to the assessment that the last one that you completed. Okay, and why that's nice is then, as long as all the data is there, you just hit save, and it's going to take you to the next screen in the progression of the assessment. Okay. So now, if you needed to exit a member who is in the household, but everybody else is staying, then it's program enrollment, click the gear, click member, click on the member's name, and then complete exit assessment. So as we said, so click gear, member, and then all the members in the household will come up. You select the one you want to exit by clicking on their name, and then complete exit assessment will launch the exit assessment workflow for that particular client, okay? So HUD Universal, you won't be triggered to answer anything. There's no universal questions that get asked at exit when you do the exit using the correct workflow. And you just save, it'll bring you to the HUD program screen, HUD Financial, HUD Health, and you'll be done. And that will exit that member from the enrollment. All right, so those will be available on the slides for you to use when you have that particular problem. You guys don't need that. All right, any questions on the stuff we've covered so far? I actually want to make a note, though, that we're going to evaluate chronic homeless. So we don't forget. Okay. All right, so then the next item is I want to talk about the new one-time field, which came into being around October 2017, project start date versus housing move-in date. Okay, so project start date is essentially the date that the person was accepted into the program. And let's just go look at that definition one more time. So project start date is the traditional date that you would have for the client once the person was approved or met criteria, or had agreed to move into your project. That wasn't necessarily the housing move-in date. So you may have approved the client for housing on on August 1st, but they might not have physically moved into the apartment until August 30th, for example. So your project start date would be 8/1, your housing move-in date would be 8/30. Now this is obviously different in a lot of ways than historically you may have been doing things. You may have always dated the program enrollment start date, the date the person actually occupied the unit. That's not necessarily wrong. All HUD is saying is that now they want you to think of the project start date as the date that the client was approved for services. And the move-in date is the date they physically moved into housing. And that's what this one-time field is here. For PSH, it's not as a vital data element as it is for like rapid rehousing or SSVF, for example. But they still want you to evaluate it. So anybody that came into the project prior to October 1, 2017, caseworthy would have been responsible for automatically updating this one-time field, the move-in date to equal the project start date. Let's see if that opens. So my move-in date would be 07/01/2017 because this was prior to the new rule. Okay, and that's all. If it's blank for your client, that's all you would have to do is click here and fill in the move-in date as equal to your project start date. If this were some date after 10/1/17, and let's say, so this person was accepted to the program on 7/22/2018, but the move-in date was, let's say, oh, I'm sorry, that's a path. I don't want to use that one. I don't have another, we'll use this as another example because this is a path enrollment, which is different than a PSH enrollment. So let's say that this person's project start date was 7/1/2018. Well, then we could make their move-in date. Let's say it was actually 8/01/2018 was their actual move-in date. And again, that's fine for it to be after. Just can't be before. It can be equal to or later, but it can't be before project start. Okay? So for your PSH projects, you have this one-time field where you want to make sure you go in and put in whatever the move-in date is. Move-in date is the same date for all enrollments because it's only attached to the household enrollment. Remember, this is the household enrollment, not the individual member enrollment. So you only have to do it here. You don't have to go into member and look at the individual member dates and assign a move-in date. Okay? You only do this at the household level, not the member level. It's a key distinction. All right? A person can have a different member enrollment start, but the move-in date is going to be whatever the household move-in date was that you determined. Any questions on move-in and project start? Oops, wrong one. But I have the definitions here that HUD provides, a little bit long-winded, but again, it gives you all the detail of the difference with project start and move-in. You guys don't need rapid rehousing or SSVF or homeless prevention or that. Okay. Does anybody want to do a program enrollment, or do you all feel pretty strong about your program enrollment prowess? My assumption would be, yeah. I mean, most of you have been doing PSH for a while and you have the enrollments down. We can certainly do one if somebody's new out there, hasn't done very many. We can run through a program enrollment. I would want to know, though, when you do a program enrollment, you're going to add client here versus add new up here. I've seen some people go up here. You don't want to do that. You want to go to add client and then HMIS intake. So that's number one. So does anybody need to go through an enrollment, or does everybody feel pretty comfortable with enrollments?
We feel comfortable with enrollment.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I know for most of you, the real sort of bane of your existence is the APR and annual assessments. So we can spend, I think, a good chunk of time on that on that fun stuff. All right, so let's talk about annual assessments. Annual assessments, the rules are 30 days before or after the enrollment start month and day. So if the person's enrollment or the project enrollment start date, and you want to look at this from the perspective of the head of household, because that's where it's measured. If the start date is 7/1/17, then you have an annual assessment that's due sometime between 6/2/17 and 7/29/7/30/17. You have that 30-day window. I'm sorry, 18. So it'd be 6/2/18 to the 7/30/2018 would be the allowable window for your enrollment for annual assessment. Now, the APR does provide you a couple of tools to help decide what your start date should be for your annual assessment. And if you run the APR, which I always recommend that when you're getting ready to do, oops, hit the wrong browser. When you're getting ready to do an annual assessment or annual assessments for your project, run your APR. Your APR is going to tell you who's due within your grant year. And if you go to your APR for here, I'm just going to pre-pop. Everybody know how to save an APR form so you don't have to put in the dates and projects every time you go in here? Yeah? So for example, if I have an APR due this month, so we'll say 08-1-2017 to 07-31-2018, and it's for, we'll just pick on Kim Wilson Housing there because I have it. So if this is your APR setup, you can save it and call it whatever you want, KWH APR, hit save, and then close. And then if I leave this screen and come back, because I want to rerun the APR for some reason, come back, it should be in this list here, KWH APR. It'll pop you everything, and I just hit report. Okay? So that's a nice little feature. It makes your life as the APR evaluator at your agency much nicer than what. Actually, let me use Salvation Army because I know what they're. Thought I had one. Yeah. Let's use that one. Let me set this up. So it makes it much easier when you're going back and forth on an APR for a particular project. And the nice thing is also, once you've edited something, you never have to close this APR. All you have to do is refresh it. And we'll talk about that as well for those of you who haven't used the refresh button. Okay, so here's your basic APR. I always like to export the APR to Excel. The primary report is what it's considered. And I start here with my evaluation. Obviously, first thing you want to look at is, does the client count make sense? If it does, then you can continue to move forward. I will point out that those of you who have projects where children have aged from 17 to 18, once they become an adult, they no longer get counted here, they get counted here, okay? They're 18, so they're an adult child. They're still part of the family, but they just don't get counted in the child bucket any longer. And that's a key distinction because a lot of your projects, there might be age specific where once the household has aged out, meaning there's no more minors, you may have to get some guidance from HUD on whether or not you can keep serving them or what the rules are to keep serving them. But just so you know that if you are evaluating your project and you see 42 children here, but you say, wait a minute, we have, I ran my APR and my APR says I have, 48 or 47 children. Well, the caseworthy does not change, nor do you have an option to handle a situation where you have a child who's gone from 18 or 17 to 18 or 20 for that matter. As you can see, the 20-year-old is still identified as child. There's no adult-child distinction. So age is really the distinction of whether or not somebody's an adult. So don't just get caught up with that. If you're evaluating your APR and you know you have 43 children, you look here and you isolate your child column. You know, you isolate your child column and you say, hey, yeah, you know, that I've got 47 people that show up as child. Well, that's because some of those children are in children by label, but not children by age, okay? And then the other thing too is if you see this with only children, it means you have a problem with some of your records. You have some children who've been disconnected from the household enrollment, and you'll need some help fixing that. I would definitely say, especially if you had a number this large of households with only children, that you definitely ask for help on that, because we can probably fix it fairly quick, which it might take you some time to diagnose and figure out what to do with the child records. So a couple of things to identify if you deal with families and children. All right. Then next, usually the demographic data is usually pretty accurate. You just want to be on the lookout for any don't knows, data not collected, missing values. Otherwise, you have a 95%, well, you have a 5% cushion, I should say. HUD allows for 95% accuracy on almost all the UDEs, other than disabling condition and veteran. Disabling condition and veteran, they want a 100% data collection, meaning a definitive answer, yes or no. They don't want don't know, refused, unknown. They want either yes or no for disabling condition stuff. Where you'll start to see other problems is when you get to the Q13 tables. And this is where the data incongruence comes in. So Q13A2, for example, you show data not collected on 4 and condition unknown on 11. Well, this is that scenario where there's data incongruence between HUD universal, disabled yes, no, and HUD program disability types are all no, or there's some that are yes. So I'm just going to go look at that now. Disable. Okay, and anytime I start to evaluate a column on a detail export from the APR, everybody knows how to get their detail export off their APR. I might have jumped past that one. Please tell me if you don't know, because it is very quick to show. Everybody aware how to get this spreadsheet?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. All right. So anytime I start working on a column, I always highlight it in yellow. It makes it easier to find and get back to. So disabling condition at entry, universal assessment at entry. There's a couple things you would want to look for here. So number one, you have some blanks. So that's an easy one to diagnose. There's 7 total that I've just highlighted here because it gives me the count. It won't give me a count on a blank column. So there's 7 records. These 7 are blank for the disabling condition yes, no at HUD universal. And if we go back and look at our APR, and we go down here, actually we'll get down to where it's a total count. You'll see condition unknown is 7 for all stairs. And these are most likely the 7 records that are the problem. I'm going to go back to my column. And so I've identified those 7. Now the next one is those conditions unknown. It's at 11. So first I'm going to look at who's yes for disabled, and then who's got a 0 in number of conditions. And there you have 11 records who are yes for disabled, but all their conditions are no. They don't have any identified. So here's my 11 client records I have to go look at. The other one you want to evaluate is the opposite of this scenario, which is those who are no for disabled, but have disabling conditions identified. You can see there's a few records. So these conditions are not currently being counted because the APR first looks at the qualifying question. And if it says no here, it doesn't matter what you have here. It's going to ignore it. So if you are no here, but yes here, then you're showing less, a smaller number of mental health, substance abuse, developmental, HIV. You're showing less of those counts than are probably the reality. So you would want to go to these assessments and change them to yes. And then all of this data, these, it's a total count of 7, those 7 records will update on your APR tables. All right, so that's what's impacting your condition unknown, don't know, refused, or missing for Q13 C2, B2, and A2. A2 is number of conditions that start. B2 is those who exited. So these people presumably are exited, but we've already captured them, we've already found them. And then these people are your stayers. So you want to, again, look for these conditions unknown and then these info missing. And you can isolate as you need to. You can isolate if you want to look at just leavers, for example. The leaver stayer column is at the end here. So you could just look at leavers and then you could isolate for stayers as well. Okay. All right, so the next place where you'll start to see problems, you will have this for DV, because it's a multi-layered question. A lot of times you'll see issues with either data not collected, or really where it'll pop up is when you get to the qualifying question after DV yes or no, and you can evaluate that at the end of the APR. Your DV questions are broken out here. And this you would just look for that incongruence again. So if DV is yes, but then for some reason if you had missing data here, that would be a problem. The other one to look at is if DV is no, but then you had responses here, you would want to clean those up. That means at one point this was yes, somebody answered these questions and then realized it should have been no. And instead of clearing the question, let me go there so you can see what I'm referring to. So instead of clearing the question, they actually left the data in float, quote unquote. And I'll show you what I mean there. And this is actually an important piece of information when you're doing data entry and you realize you've made a mistake where qualifying questions are involved. So you have somebody, their DV is yes, and you've answered the qualifying questions. Now let's say you realize you made a mistake that DV should be no, and you say, oh, wait a minute, it should have been no. You've left those qualifying questions out there and available for the APR to pick up. And that's how you can have data in these columns, even though the answer is no. So just make sure, I'll get that right, just make sure you back out these responses to nothing and then change to no, if that's the case, and then resave, all right? Okay. So we're gonna look, that was the DV questions. Living situation night prior. This is important if you can only serve people who come from a homeless situation. So if all your clients should be coming from a homeless situation, great. You can have children in your project who don't. That's allowable, obviously, as long as the head of households are coming from a homeless situation. Oh, did I crash? I did. Shoot. Why does this keep happening? Can you all hear me, or did I disappear? Okay, my screen is frozen, so stay on the call. It looks like Zoom crashed on my side. Stay on the call. I'm going to power down, power back up, and I'll rejoin, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I wonder if we mentioned something from the but with all the area you're trying to I mean, it would be kind of a group of folks who want to go to attend training, like you putting on a stage next week. We're also recording all the trainings from this week next week. In case folks aren't able to come, or they might have slipped out in the bathroom, might have been recording feed, so then we're going to load on our website. Yeah, I'll let everyone know what their website they uploaded. Thank you.
All right, I'm back. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me get logged back in.
We have to find out. She doesn't have it tomorrow.
Okay. All right, I should hopefully see my screen again. Let me get back here. Okay. Let's get my report back up. Okay. All right. Hopefully we won't have that problem again. I had it on Tuesday. I was doing a webinar and it locked up like that where the screens froze. So I'm not sure if there's something up with Zoom. Hopefully we'll be okay. We were fine yesterday through the whole, for both classes. So let's see how we go. Where's my... Okay. Restart that. I think I made any changes. Okay. All right, so let's get back into looking at the APR. We're on the prior residents, so where they were prior to enrolling. Okay, so again, as I was saying, you want to make sure that in most cases, well, I guess everybody could still hear me. It was just that the screen froze, correct?
Correct.
So did you hear, where I had left off is that we were talking about prior residents to project start or living situation prior to project start. For your projects where the people have to come from a homeless situation, you just have to make sure at the very least the head of household has that designation, because if you're dealing with children, it's very possible the children came from an environment different from where the head of household came from. So that's okay, but again, the key is that all household members come from the allowable, the head of household comes from the allowable location. Income is where you get in, as most of you have experienced, is where you get into your annual assessments. Now, some things to evaluate here is just check your entry data too. So the client doesn't know, data not collected, those kind of things. You definitely want to make sure you have the best entry data possible on your projects. And then you'll get into annual assessment. So you can't have an annual assessment if you have a client doesn't know or data not collected. You're going to want to make sure you have valid start date data to measure against as best as you can. And then the system will tell you how many people you have due for an annual assessment. So don't get caught in the trap of doing an annual assessment on everybody. And I think most of you come to terms with that at this point, is that you should be evaluating those people who are due for an annual assessment within your grant report range. So if your grant is a 7.1 to 6.30, and you're working on that APR right now, those are the only clients you should be worrying about. You'll have a value of, it'll tell you how many clients it would be in the data not collected section. It would tell you how many clients are due for an annual assessment that the system doesn't see. It tells you how many are not yet due based on the date that they entered your project. So this could be people who have not been in the project for a total of 12 months. You also want to evaluate exit data. You want to make sure you have valid exit information on the adult members of your project as they leave. HUD definitely expects that for a PSH project that you're going to have that kind of clients. Right. So annual assessment, the system, the detail export gives you the information you need to do an annual assessment. Let me just get my focus back. Okay, so the annual assessment column will tell you yes or no for who's due. You change that to yes. Now in my example here, this is There's just one client who's due within the report date range based on when they entered into the project. It will tell you the allowable date range that you can put in when you create the annual assessment. And so now you know which client you have to go to. And if this was one client or 50 clients, you would have the list here, and then you could go find that client and create the annual assessment and update the record. Is everybody aware of that and the detail that it shows you which client is due? Okay, so if you didn't, that's great, because then this gives you one extra tool, and it also provides you the date range that you need. So one of the hazards I have is a lot of times people, when they're evaluating their annual assessment, the system says you have 25 people due for income. On this detail export, you go right to the income column, and you have the income at entry, the latest income is your annual assessment column. And they go here and they isolate all the blanks, and you say, oh my God, there's 45 clients here who need an annual assessment at income. Well, that's not the case. Income's only, number one, it's only measured on adults. So before you even look at who's due for an annual, you want to first isolate by the annual assessment column. That's why I always highlight it, because it makes it easier to find. You always want to isolate by annual. And then the next thing you would want to isolate by, if you're evaluating income, you would want to isolate by age, not by their status in the household, child, adult, or head of household or other member, not by here, but by the age at last entry. So you wouldn't want to look at annual assessment, yes, income column, because that income latest column is still going to show child records, because all you've asked the system to do is tell you who's due for an annual assessment. Children are due for annual assessments for HUD health insurance. All adults are due for annual assessment for HUD health, non-cash, and income. So if you're evaluating your income table, okay, you want to make sure you isolate just adults. And that would mean you would have to isolate everybody 18 and over, and that would be your true annual assessment update that you have to worry about for your APR. Once you've done income, then evaluate non-cash, because non-cash is also adults. Once you've done those two, then you can go down and worry about your HUD health insurance, which would be all members who are due for an annual, adults and children. Okay, so then you wouldn't have to isolate just adults any longer. You could take off that filter and you could evaluate for all household members. Okay, any questions about those? All right, length of stay is pretty self-explanatory. This one is just for rapid rehousing, so as PSH, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, the next kind of cool thing is I want to show you is that, let's say you find this client record that you have to update. You find this client, you do the update, you go and you look the client up and you update well, let's talk about an annual assessment first of all, before we go to that step. Everybody told me to use the annual assessment workflow, complete annual assessment. So you go and do that. Then once you've done that step, you can go back to your report and just click this refresh button. So leave your report window open. Don't close it. Click refresh. That will refresh the data, and the annual assessment you just created will then populate the report, presumably, assuming it was dated correctly and those steps are done correctly. That'll save you a lot of time from having to go back to the report screen, reload the report, rerun the report, and then see what you did. All you have to do is just keep this open in the background, refresh it, and it saves you a lot of steps. Okay? Now, when it comes to the annual assessment, let me just get the other thing that's important to note, and I have a note on it here, let me get down to that. And this is where I see an occasional misstep with the annual assessment. And that is in the dates around the annual assessment. And why I want to point this out is that people will do an annual assessment. Let's say you're running your APR, your APR date is 7/1/17 to 6/30/18. You go out there and you do the annual assessment, but the annual assessment is dated for 2018, and you don't have any annual assessment that lands within this date range that goes from 7/1/17 to 6/30/18. You do one that's dated, 8/1/18, something like that, because you've done it manually. You haven't gone through the workflow. You say, oh, I've got an annual assessment. Why isn't it working? It's because it's, number one, it's not dated correctly. Number two, it's not dated within the report date range. You want to make sure you have an annual assessment for every year over that anniversary date for the client. So if the client came into your project in July of 2015, you want to make sure you have an annual assessment dated July 2016, July 2017, July 2018. You have to have an annual assessment dated within the year of that report range, okay? So make sure you have one of each. If you go and you look and you don't see an annual assessment dated in 2017, but you see one dated in 2018, it doesn't mean that 2018 is being read by the APR. So make sure you look at that annual assessment column for allowable dates, and make sure you have something that falls within the grant report period. The other thing is that what sometimes people freak out a little bit about is that it's August 30th, 2018, your client's anniversary date was February 2018. It doesn't mean that you're too late. You can still create an annual assessment, just date it within the allowable date range of that February anniversary, okay? So that's why it's really useful that maybe, twice a year, run your APR, see who's due for an annual within that APR date range. You can update them then, or at least a month before your grant year end, run the APR to see who's going to be due within that date range. That'll help you start the process. And then, as always, you have 90 days from the end of your grant year to prepare your APR and submit it. So the worst case scenario, the day after your grant year ends, so 7/1/2018 for a 6/30/2018 end, run your APR and start cleaning up the data so it's ready before that 90-day mark to upload to Sage. Any questions on annual assessments? No? All right. Let's dig a little deeper into our friend, the APR. Okay. All right, so there's more than the primary report, which is what we're looking at here. There's the detail sub-report, which I clicked on to get my Excel export. Then there's the, there's the hyperlink to Q5 and Q6 tables. You have to evaluate these as well. So I'm going to click on that hyperlink. There's some basic information here about your client records, obviously. One thing you want to make sure of is your head of household count. Adult heads of household, make sure that numbers make sense for the number of individual household heads of household that you've served. So this would be the person who's identified as self in the household, because that is actually, there's a measure that happens in Sage, and if that number doesn't match elsewhere on the APR, you'll get an error for that. So just make sure that number makes sense. Then you're going to get into some of the Ude tables, where it talks about personal identifying information, name, social, date of birth, things like that. Social Security. For Social Security, if you don't know the client's Social Security number, this is how you should represent it. I'll show you here. So if you don't know, do not put, wait a minute, all zeros and then say full Social Security. That will show as an error on this table. Okay, that will come up as an error. It will come up as a data issue for Social Security number. The APR knows what a valid Social Security number should look like. And if you try to put in junk data, I mean, you could put in a slew of numbers and it probably won't pick that up. But if you put all zeros, all ones, all twos, it will identify that and say, hey, take a look at this, it might not be right. If you truly don't have the social security number for a client, don't put anything in here. Just say data not collected, okay? That's how that should be represented. You'll still get numbers here. You'll have client doesn't know refused or information missing, but if you really don't have it, then you don't have it. HUD allows for a 5% cushion, so just try to be at 5% or less for info missing or don't know refused for social security number. The other one that's a fun new issue with the APR is date of birth. Date of birth cannot be equal to project enrollment start date. So if a client has a newborn and the child was born on 8/30/2018, the child's project start date cannot be 8/30/2018. You would have to make it 8/31/2018 or whatever day the child joined the family in the apartment after they've been born and after they leave the hospital. So where you're going to see that problem is a lot of times the date of birth issue will come up. You'll see it here, and it's because the client's date of birth matches the project start date. So you would have to edit that. And the nice thing about these tables, if you click on this link, it actually brings you to the client IDs and tells you the problem with the ID, and you can just go to the ID, then you go back in, find the client ID, and you fix the problem. The next place where you're going to see issues is going to be with income and housing data. You're going to see income problems. Well, let's talk first about destination. Destination, especially for PSH projects, if you have a client whose exit destination is unknown, don't know, or no exit interview completed, it's going to show on this table. The assumption for a PSH project is that you've developed a relationship with the client and you're able to get quality exit data on that client when they leave. Definitely avoid at all costs having no exit interview completed for a client or family leaving a PSH project. It may happen, but again, that should be a very small number. Income and sources at start. If you have an income and sources at start error, it's because the project start date is different than the entry assessment date on the financial assessment. And we'll go look at that. So if you look at your project start date first, we'll go there. So project start date 7/1/2017. Now let's go look at the HUD assessments. And if you go look at the financial assessment, and you look at the entry date for the enrollment, that's part of the APR. If this date is different than project start, you have to change it to match project start. Your project start date and your assessment entry dates should match. And that goes for family members. So that's where knowing the member start date is important, because your member start date should match your entry assessment start dates. So if you have a family member who starts on 8/1/18, that person's entry assessments should be dated 8/1/18. So if they're not, they'll show up on this table as an issue. Okay? The same with income sources at exit. It's doing a date match there. Income sources at annual. It's this one you're most likely going to need our help with, because if you get an error here, it's usually because there's a incorrectly dated annual assessment that may not be visible to you. It may have been deleted. It may be part of an enrollment that was deleted, and it's floating out there in space and being picked up by the APR. This is your chronic homeless table. This is only going to evaluate if there's a problem with a chronic homeless calculation, one of the variables there. So generally, rarely see a problem there, but if you see a problem there, it'll tell you the client record, and again, it's looking at don't know, refused, missings. But if you're 100% sure the data is there, it might be, again, because of a floating assessment out there somewhere. Timeliness. Timeliness is one of the newer tables, and this is looking at the project start date, okay, versus the effective start date. The project start date is the date you give it. You know, the client, you give them a start date of 7/1/2018. But you don't enter that data into HMIS until 8/1/2018. So you have an effective start date of 8/1/2018 and a project start date of 7/1/2018. That's telling HUD that the timeliness of your data entry for that client was 30 days apart. The client really started in your project on 7/1, but you didn't add them to the system until 8/1. What HUD is trying to do is let you know that they're going to start to squeeze that time frame, that they're going to set a benchmark that at some point, there's going to be a benchmark that says clients need to be entered into HMIS on or before 30 days or 15 days of the project start date. Just be on the lookout for that. Next one is for emergency shelters you don't have to worry about. All right. The last table, and I'm kind of navigating up here. I should point these out. So if you want to move to the end, to the last page of any of these reports, you just click this arrow with a line, it takes you to the last page. If you want to do page by page, you just click these arrows. If you want to go back to the primary report or the parent report, you click this arrow in the circle. If you want to refresh the report because you just fixed some data, then you click that. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the parent report. And now we're going to look at the last couple tables. The hyperlink to part 2, these are all exit destinations. These are a breakout of veterans that you served. So this will be demographic of any veterans. And this is your chronic homeless stuff. So if you're an agency that focuses on chronic homeless, this is where you'll see that breakout that talks about the household chronic homeless count versus the individual chronic homeless count. And that's these two tables here. Number of households with at least one or more chronic homeless persons, number chronically homeless persons by household, okay? So this is where the system is gonna do the sort of conversion for you. So if you have a household of, if we're just talking about one household, you have one household where there's somebody chronic, so that's one chronic homeless household, and there's 2 people, then it's one chronic homeless household, 2 chronically homeless people. So this table you can use to evaluate that to make sure the report is seeing all your chronic homeless the way you feel they should. Okay. And let me go back to the parent report. And then exit destination is in hyperlink part 2. And this one you should look at as well, because this is going to tell HUD where anybody who left your project, where they went. And it's very easy to click on the wrong item out of the list. If you're a PSH project, your expectation is that the majority of your clients are discharging or exiting to a favorable exit, whether that's another PSH or some other rental situation, whether it's subsidized or not. You want to be careful of temporary and obviously going back to emergency shelter or place not meant for habitation would be a big issue. But even temporary destination is not ideal. So just make sure that your staff are selecting the right one because they're very similar. So staying or living with a family in a temporary tenure versus staying or living with family permanent. It's very common that the staff person accidentally grabs the temporary option versus the permanent option. So this is where you would want to fix it. So if these 2 people you know should be up here, then you can see where people exited to in the detail export. You can go to the exit destination column. And from here, you can see what those destinations are. And you can isolate and find out, who are the 2 people that went to a temporary setting or anybody that went to a temporary setting for that matter. And you would want to fix those, okay? All right. So that's the sort of the nuts and bolts of the APR, the majority of the tables. Don't ever get caught in a situation where you're evaluating your APR for hours upon hours upon hours. If you're really struggling fixing data, send an email so we can get on a screen share with you. And there are certain circumstances where we can do bulk updates. So if there's something that is clearly an issue, we might be able to fix that a little bit quicker than you can do it going in and out of each record. In some cases, there's nothing you can do, but you have to go in and out of each record. But we can at least isolate the problem, hopefully, to help you avoid the hunt and peck to try to figure out what the problem is. I definitely offer that up and welcome you to get assistance when you're doing your APR. And when it comes to letting us know about an APR, whether it's you're sending an email to Sherry or Hannah or myself, is that we would need to know the program name, we would need to know the start and end date, and then if you do know the tables that you're having a problem with, just tell us, table Q13 B1, and then if you happen to have isolated a few clients, you can let us know a couple of client IDs. But it's vital that we know the project name and the start and end dates of the APR to help out. Very often people do send an email saying, hey, I'm having a problem with my APR, I don't know what's wrong. And there's not a lot we can do with that. If we know some of the basic information, we can actually evaluate it quickly and probably just tell you which fields you have to update. Because a lot of times, again, people over-update. They update things that don't impact that particular APR. And the other item that's also helpful on your detail, and which is also why I show the enrollment ID, is it actually tells you which enrollment it's looking at for the APR. There's this enrollment ID column. So the APR is telling you for this client or for this household is looking at an ID number 2913152. Okay, and that's important because the last thing you want to do is go into a client record and start evaluating the wrong enrollment. Okay, that's why this enrollment ID is important. And what can happen is this enrollment might be the enrollment that's no longer visible to you for some reason. Okay, so you could be working on this enrollment and it's not even the one that's impacting the report. So that's why it's also important to pay attention to that. There's a lot of what I would say is like kind of junk data still floating around since your conversion that needs to be cleaned up because enrollments have been deleted, households have been deleted, and there's a lot of assessments still floating around there that haven't been tied to an enrollment properly. So definitely be aware of that enrollment ID number. And the other important value is for you family projects is the family ID number, okay? Because you want to make sure you're evaluating the correct family as well. And that's that dynamic or that situation where you have a person who's part of more than one family. Well, you might not even see that other family because it's been deleted for some reason, but that enrollment for that family is still out there. And that is what the report is seeing. So you can check family ID and then you can go check, oh, I gotta stop doing that. Then you can go check to see the family ID that you're seeing by going to case management, family and contacts, and you can see the family ID number that the report is seeing. So these are the things that can cause you to bang your head against the wall. You could be updating data for the wrong enrollment. You could be updating data for the wrong family. And you're thinking you're doing the right information, but the report is looking at something totally different. So make sure you check those things if you notice that you fix something and the APR doesn't change. It might be an enrollment ID or a family ID problem, because those are some of the things that we look at first. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, we looked at all these. Yeah, so that's just about everything there. Is there anything that people want to go through, practice, take a look at that we didn't cover? Any questions you've run into that you haven't had a chance to talk over yet?
Can you talk about in the APR how the length of stay is calculated? Because every time, even before case 40, that was a constant issue of it not being correct.
Okay. So length of stay is going to be based on.
Not that part.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Not that part, the average down there.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, the average and median. I would have to get the code, the exact coding spec to look at and make sure I address it correctly. I can put something together I can draft something that will tell you exactly what the report is looking at when it measures average length of stay.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're calculating it when we check the same way.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can put that together.
Okay, great.
Probably want my. Oh yeah, so this is my automated save. Let me just make sure there. Okay. All right. So I'll put that together. Right up. And I also had what child records and CH evaluation was the other one we had to talk about. Okay. Yep. Anything else that anybody wants to, let me get back here, to review or has a question about?
So when we're running like the monthly compliance reports and it shows like we have those errors under the income thing, but then when we go back and check it, it looks like all the income assessments are there and it's accurate, and we'll email Mark and then they'll fix it on his back end. Is there a way that we can learn how to kind of clean up some of our data on our own? Or do we always have to just email it? Because then it's like, I don't know.
It would depend on the error. I would have to know specifically, like we'd have to look at an actual circumstance. But when you say
Well, they
compliance,
just fix them. So that's my question. Like we emailed it, Mark fixes it, and then they're fixed, but I don't know. I don't know what was wrong
okay.
or
Yeah,
why
I
it
would-
was showing us an error.
Yeah, then I would just ask them to maybe give you an idea of what the problem was. It might have been something you could have fixed, but there's many cases where it might not have been. But when you say compliance report, what report are you referring to?
Like we have to do the monthly compliance report. I can show you, go to compliance, go to report. So go down.
The data quality report?
report.
Yeah, so this actually brings up a good point. It is also really important because there's several fund reports to, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to pull that out of your hat right now as I was talking about it, but try to make sure when you send the email that you say the exact name of the report as it appears in HMIS and the exact name. Yeah, that's fine too. And the exact name of the project. A lot of times when people send in an issue, they say, you know, they give the abbreviation of the project name or some sort of known name, but again, definitely knowing the exact name. So yeah, so the data quality report, if you run into a problem here, in general, this report follows a lot of the same rules as the APR that the Q5, Q6 sub-report off the APR.
It's only Q4. Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
Q4
Yeah,
is
so-
the one we always have issues with.
Right. Yeah, so if you have an income start date issue here, like that, is this one of the places you saw an error?
Normally I think it's either start or annual, but then on the, like, click on it, so do the sub-detail report and do what it's saying, the error message.
Well, it's got actual client data, so I can't, because we're on the.
It's normally saying like income assessment not attached or null, but then you go into the actual assessments and it's there.
Yeah, so most likely, my guess would be, is that there's a problem with the numeric link between the enrollment and the visible assessment. And I'm going to show you from the backside here what I'm talking about. So every enrollment, as you know, has an enrollment ID number. That's this number here. Every assessment has an enrollment ID number and an assessment ID number. So you have the enrollment ID and you have the assessment ID. And this is where things can get very jumbled from the perspective of the APR. So you might not even see the annual assessment or the assessment that the APR is looking at, which is why Mark or myself would have to fix it on the back end. I'll usually say what happened. I'll usually say, hey, yeah, you had a deleted assessment that the APR was still reading, or you had an assessment that was disconnected from the valid enrollment, something along those lines. But what you're going to have for, I would say, for a period of time, because you guys converted technically last year, but there's still a lot of sort of straggler data that is going to show up here and there that's going to need to be cleaned up from the back end. But in most circumstances, or in some circumstances, you can fix this problem if it's related to the project start date and the assessment start date not being the same. That is something you could fix.
Okay.
Okay.
And I had that same problem, and Sherry helped me with it, and I was getting error messages there, and she told me I just had to go into the financial records and resave it.
We tried that.
It didn't work?
And I don't know what they did on the back end. I just, like I said, if we can fix things on our own, I just sometimes feel that it's easier. But if it's always where it's more on the back end and we can't, that's fine. I just didn't want to create work if I didn't need to for somebody else.
Right, no, exactly.
So we had to delete a second assessment that was created, so you couldn't see it from your view. But the back end, it was like a floating one, so that was creating and that was fun because at the beginning, they kept having us delete enrollment. Yeah, it was like assessment, error. Okay, that makes sense now. I didn't have it with Anthony. I think we had to go in and delete a lot of the assessments that you could invisibly see on the case manager or system admin. Okay, I had to go through like a different view and then kind of delete those because it was kind of like, I guess.
So what I will say is this, is that there will be a time in the near future where giving you all as end users more power on data cleanup will be reasonable. But right now, because of the state of the data since the conversion, there's cleanup on the back end that really needs to happen before. And really deleting enrollments should have, it was the same mistake Connecticut made. When we converted, delete enrollments is a out-of-the-box feature that Caseworthy allows. It allows the user to delete an enrollment, but they should also have you delete assessments, and you can't. What we found out in Connecticut is that users were doing just that. They were deleting enrollments that they either screwed up or thought were wrong, and we ended up having to do all this cleanup for like the first 3 months after the conversion. And then we took that ability away until the system was much cleaner. So, but yeah, definitely, there's a lot of savvy users out there that you guys could easily fix the stuff we fix. And when I say we, I'm meaning Nutmeg and Mark together.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to point out the notion of resaving an existing assessment. In some cases, that will work. And how you have to do it, you just go into, whether it's financial, universal, whichever, you physically go to edit and then let it load and then save it. Sorry, I got to select the income amount. Save it here, check the income amount, hit save. And there are circumstances where that will fix the problem. It doesn't do it all the time, but sometimes it will.
Okay. This is just random, and I don't know, you've been working with Caseworthy clearly longer than we have. Is it ever a possibility to when you would do like a Doreen financial assessment to have that data like pull forward in reports? Because like a lot of our clients in PSH, like if you're only doing it once a year, it's hard to really get that data accurate because it changes so frequently.
Yeah, so what you have to understand about the APR, HUD provides the coding specifications for everything in HMIS. Everything is coded based on the rules that HUD lays out. HUD is the one who got rid of the during assessment and broke it down to just a 1-year event. And all they want to know is during the operating year, at this point, what is that client's income? So you could have the client, so let's say that you have a client who's changes income, let's see, so you're on your grant year is 7/1 to 6/30. And in January, your client's income goes up from $500 to $1,000. Well, their annual assessment, let's say, isn't due until May. So when you do their May annual assessment, you adjust their income at that point. So then that income increase will show. Where you'll have a problem is if that income increase happens outside of your annual report or your grant due date, but then it's still okay because you're going to catch it on the next APR. So you just have to look at when did the income change occur? Did it occur during the grant year? And if so, then the annual assessment, as long as it's due, will pick up that income increase. If the annual assessment and the grant year happen, and then the income increase happens sometime after that, well, then you'll catch it on the next APR. So is there a situation where you had a client's income occur that you weren't able to show on an annual assessment?
No, I think as case managers, we kind of just like checks and balances.
Okay.
Like, it seems odd to enter it once a year when we know that it changes so frequently. And I think just from our old database system, we were used to like just updating their financials so frequently.
Well,
that now it just,
that used to be the way HUD did it. HUD created the annual assessment in 2015 and then put it live in 2016. Prior to that, people did during program assessments, in concert when the person's income changed. It's just now HUD has said that they want everybody doing the annual assessment the same way. They want everybody measuring things the same way across the country because they want to track income. And because as you know, with any analysis, the data that you use has to be congruent across the system. So the way it used to be, people were changing income a lot of times at a lot of different rules. Some agencies did it exactly when it happened. Some agencies, they just did it once a year. And some agencies did it to make sure it happened during the grant report year so it looked good for the report. So what HUD has done is they've created the annual assessment. And if your client has an income increase, but let's say they're not due for an annual assessment, well, then you don't get penalized for that because they're not due for an annual assessment on that report. So you're not going to be responsible for it until the next report. So they work through the idea by having those who are due for an annual versus those who aren't, and then just saying, whatever income change the person has, you can reflect that change when you do their annual update. That's an important thing to keep in mind and to understand is that whether it's Caseworthy or some other HMIS out there, they all follow the same rules that HUD puts forward for coding, for the types of questions, how the question's asked, and then how the data lands on the APR. Has everybody done a Sage upload?
yes.
Okay. So just a quick note about Sage. Nor Mark nor Nutmeg has Sage rights, quote unquote. So if you have a Sage issue that is not APR related, there's something, Sage, you go into Sage and a grant ID is wrong, something is wrong there, you have to obviously go through the Sage help desk to get support on that. But let's say if you upload a Sage report and Sage shows a validation error saying that, your head of household count on table 1 doesn't match your head of household count on table 8. Well, that's something then obviously Mark or Nutmeg can assist with. But as long as you all have had the fun practice of uploading to Sage, it's a pretty user-friendly database. So. And again, just making sure everybody knows that you upload to Sage by doing a CSV export and where to find those exports after you run them, that kind of stuff. Yeah, okay. I'm assuming there's all nodding for that one.
Yeah.
Okay. We're still a little bit, it's 10:40. I can stop the recording and then we could look at actual client questions. that you all have, if you have something specific about one of your projects.